Welcome back to Lust is Boring. Quick pop quiz for you. I want you to name your favorite 2 or 3 dating stories from the lives of the saints, okay? I want you to think of canonized saints you know, of their courtship experiences, of what their dating and single life was like, and how they met and how they fall in love. Quick, give me 2 or 3 stories. Can't think of 2, 3, 1, 0. Join the club. We've got all the stories in the world on the saints who became priests and nuns. We've got the married couple stuff. We've got the singles who died as martyrs. But it's like there's this gaping hole in hagiography, which is the study of the lives of the saints, when it comes to their dating, their courtship. And I think those witnesses are needed now more than ever, because you don't get to see what it's like behind the scenes of, especially when you're single, you don't see these things. And it's just like, okay, how do they do this? We can't figure it out. And then when you get into marriage, it's like, okay, what is a holy marriage supposed to look like? And I think people tend to, glamorize it a little bit too much, because I remember G.K. Chesterton saying that marriage is a great adventure like going to war. Ideally not with each other, but in a sense with each other into war. But from within marriage, I'll tell you, it's nuts, especially if you're doing ministry. Typically, whenever I go out of town to do ministry, all heck breaks loose over here. If Crystal takes off to go do something, everything hits the fan. So just give you yesterday, Crystalina's over at EWTN right now doing some TV stuff for Women Made New. So I've got all the kids to myself. And so yesterday, my son Colby, he's driving to school. I'm a couple miles behind him driving little kids. And he calls me freaking out. Dad, all the engine lights are turning on. The steering wheel won't move. I can't steer hardly anymore. What do I do? I'm on the freeway. I'm like, okay, well, just take a deep breath. I want you to try to get that steering wheel, get off on the next exit, and see if you can get into some parking spot, and I'll be right there to help out. So we get there. He's in some parking lot. What the heck is going on? He's like, the car stinks. It's like something's burning up in the engine. All the engine lights are blinking. So I pop the hood and I look in there, and there's fur and feathers everywhere. And what the heck is going on? I'm like, is that a bird? Is that an owl? Is that a coyote? What the heck got into your engine? And so we're looking around, and there's definitely bird feathers and there's definitely fur. And we're like, what the heck? And all the kids are freaking out. And so I pull one of my kids' golf clubs out of the back of my pickup truck, and I'm kind of poking at this ball of fur, and I'm like, well, kids, I'll figure this out. Let me just get you to school. And I poke the fur, and it meows. And the kids are like, bah! I'm like, dude, there's a cat in your engine, and there's a bird leg over here, and it's what the heck is going on? And so I'm like, okay, kids, I was gonna deal with this later, but there's a live animal in your engine. Let me just drop you off at school. I got to come back here, call animal control services. So call animal control. Who shows up? 2 police cars, animal control. And first thing a cop asked me is why did you put a cat in your engine? I'm like, well, we're dog people. So we do that. No. And so they get all the tools, and they're pulling a bird out of there. And then finally they pull out the cat itself, still live in the engine. It's got 9 lives, but I think 8.5 of them pretty much taken that morning. But, so it's still live. And then we take the car to the dealership to get the thing fixed up. Dude, $950 later, they clean up all the feathers and fur out of the engine. They put the, drive belt back on. The, alternator's full of fur. My son starts driving, and he's like, okay, it's all done. I'm driving behind him. He turns on the air conditioning. Poof! Fur comes through the air conditioning all over him. I'm driving behind him. The fur's flying down the road. I'm shutting my windows because then the fur's flowing in here. And I'm like, yeah, that's pretty much an average typical day when one of us is off on the road doing ministry. So I think it's sometimes helpful for people who are single, anticipating the vocation of marriage, to know, hey, it's going to get a little crazy. And for those in the dating the pool, the single life, what is it supposed to look like? Because if you don't have an example that you're looking to, and we don't have many in the lives of the saints, sometimes you kind of feel like you're just going Lone Ranger. And so today we have a man who has spent a significant amount of time researching the lives of the saints, and has pulled out of them examples of what the courtship was like, how they fell in love, how they met, the struggles they went through, some that were martyred together, the sufferings they went through in their marriage. These types of witness stories are not given a platform enough. And so that's what we want to do today. today on Lust is Boring. Before we dive in, I want to thank everybody who supports this program on Patreon. It is a tremendous blessing not only to keep this podcast going, but to pay for our car bills when we have cats stuck in engines and things like that. So if you want to join our Patreon community, we'll send you free stuff, free books. You get early access to all the episodes, and you just join a community of people who are kind of behind the mission that we're doing. And so you can give $5 a month, 10, 20 bucks a month, or whatever. You just go to patreon.com/Jason Everett, hit the link in the bio, and you can support the community there. But today's guest is Patrick O'Hearn. A little bit about him. He's a husband and a father. He was the acquisitions manager at Tan Books. He's authored 6 books, got a master's in education from our alma mater, Franciscan University, and his website is contemplativeheartpress.com. So, Patrick, thank you for coming on the program today.
Hey, Jason, it's an honor to be here.
Yeah, I mean, I enjoyed your previous book on the parents of the saints, and literally just got in the mail, Courtship of the Saints. Haven't had the chance to read it, browse through it. I can't wait to read this thing. I mean, these are the stories that like you wish were in paper, and it's like, wow, someone actually found them. The blesseds, the saints, the courtships, the highs, the lows. Tell us a little bit about the inspiration behind this book, and then I want to dive into as many of these stories as we can.
Yeah, I was reflecting upon my grandparents, and, I didn't get to, they died pretty young, and I didn't get to know them. And I think I wish I kind of knew their marriage story, and many of us were blessed with relatives and just devout Catholics. And as time goes on, people slowly fall away from the faith. And we see that these marriage stories are so beautiful. We often, as you mentioned earlier, we prize the vocation of, and we should, to priesthood. And we're like, how did you get your calling? And I think too often we don't focus enough on marriage stories and just how the saints prepared. So there's kind of that inspiration. I've just always been fascinated with marriage stories. God's used me on one occasion to bring one of my friends to his spouse, and a couple other occasions was a disaster. Mm-hmm. But I just feel like it's such a beautiful topic, and really I think as we see many marriages are falling apart, sadly, 50%, right, and in divorce, and I think it's the way you prepare, and the saints, there's no better example than the saints.
Yeah. Now, maybe we can run through, maybe from beginning to end, maybe the beginning, the matchmaking piece, then the falling in love piece, the dating piece, the engagement, the marriage, the suffering, the cross. So maybe let's just begin from the beginning to end. Maybe any matchmaking stories of, saints who got other people together, or how the saints had someone help them to meet their match.
Yeah, there was a story in here I was able to use. It's Padre Pio was actually the matchmaker. There's a couple that are living today. Now, most of the couples in my book, the majority of them are saints. The rest are on their path to sainthood. And there's probably 2 couples in there that aren't saints, but someday maybe they will be. But one of them is Dr. Germain and Ortrud Bianchi, and their daughter, maybe you know the Bianchis, but their daughter is Sister Faustina Maria Bianchi. She was inspired to write the Litany of Trust, which is one of the most beautiful prayers today. And her parents they met in Italy at San Giovanni Rotondi, and Padre Pio kind of like brought them together, and he was praying over like the mother, and she felt this sensation on her shoulder. And then I think it was the same later on when she met, basically Padre Pio set them up, and then when they're praying together, she had that same feeling again, and he was kind of like their spiritual father, and brought them together.
Well, that kind of helps. So, like when the saints, met each other, any stories of where they met, how they fell in love, just the beginnings of these relationships of the saints. So before they're actually dating, any providential meetings and beginnings and falling in love of these relationships.
Yeah, I was able to interview St. Gianna's daughter, and she helped me with her mom and dad's story. And what I like about their story is they met 5 years before they actually started dating, and they met at St. Gianna's brother was a doctor, and Pietro, St. Gianna's future husband, he was going to get some treatment, and then they met each other, and they just kind of saw each other, and nothing really struck them. It was very quick. And then they met again in the hospital at another, Pietro's sister was in the hospital, and Gianna was probably in, I think, residency for medical school. And again, just simple glances. And then throughout their life, 5 years later, Saint Gianna started. She's prayed this novena to Our Lady, and on that, I think it was on the 9th day on the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. She kind of had this interior light, like you're called to marriage, because she wasn't sure if she wanted to be a missionary. And then she met her husband at a priest, a first mass of a priest. And so her husband was struck by the way she was praying and her smile. But he recalled like the way she made the sign of the cross and then her glowing smile. And here he was about 10 years older than her. So it was kind of neat that how that love, it wasn't love at first sight. And they had crossed paths with each other, but eventually it was like the right timing that they connected.
Yeah, no, I think it's an important thing to hear, because we tend to over romanticize the first meetings with somebody, and if there's not initial fireworks, sparks, whatever, people assume, okay, well, that's not the person for me. But I remember a friend of mine, Mother Miriam of the Lamb of God, we used to work together at Catholic Answers before she became a nun. Her name was Rosalind Moss. I remember her telling me once there's a Jewish word for like kind of soulmate. I think it was like beshert. And the idea behind this is that you could be living literally next door to this person for 10 years, know them, and not realize that they're the one that, God had in mind for you until you're actually living in the will of God. And that until that timing is right. And then he could reveal it to you. And so I think if we overly romanticize first meetings, I think we write off a lot of possibilities. And obviously you want to trust your gut. I mean, if you're getting red flags early on, you probably might want to listen to that. But if you're not having these head over heels infatuated first instant of meeting, don't read too much into that, because that's not the stuff that sustains lasting love anyway. So it's kind of reassuring to hear that, hey, maybe some saints met, okay, this person's nice, but I don't really see anything happening. But then as they get to know each other, you get attracted to the most attractive elements of that person, which is below skin deep.
Yeah, and Saint Zélie Martin, she was around the age of 12, and when she moved to Alençon, France, and I forget, Louis was 7 when he moved there, but he was about 7 years older than her, and so they lived in the same town for 14 years, and so they would have, I think the town, I have to look at the statistics, but I think it was like, maybe 50,000 or so. Maybe today, I don't know what the population is, but they would have certainly crossed each other's paths at church, at the church, but it wasn't really, it took them 14 years later before like they had their first interaction with each other. And I think and they often had, prior to that, their discerning religious life, and it's said that he turned down several suitors before that. So it was kind of like God, as you said, they weren't. It's all about God's timing too. Even people that are in a state of grace, they could be, their heart could be set on religious life or in the seminary, and then it's like God kind of puts them through that test, and maybe I'm not called to it. And then once they're open, then they fall in love. So it's kind of my mom always reminds me, says like falling in love, it's a miracle. I mean, it really is. You can have two people on the same page.
Yeah. Now, that was the case with Zélie, right? Wasn't her heart completely set on religious life?
She was ever since she was a little girl, she wanted to be a nun. And she was even on her the day of her wedding, like that, after they went to her sister was a nun. And she was in tears visiting her sister on her honeymoon. She's like, I want to be a nun.
Oh.
But her husband...
Yeah. Zing. Yeah. Don't take it personally there, Luis. Wow.
I know, and so many of the other saints that I put in here, even like Saint Rita of Cascia, she wanted to be a nun from the day she was a little girl, and her father said, "No, I want you. She was like their only child. I want you to take care of us." And so, I mean, she would have committed no sin to just refuse to go against her father and ran away. I mean, look at Thomas Aquinas. Look at some of the saints, but she ended up obeying her father. And eventually, her husband, he passed away. He was murdered, and she became a nun. So it's all ultimately, I think God fulfills our desires, even those that maybe they want to become nuns, but somehow it's like they become a third order sister. They're just, it's just, so anyways.
And Saint Rita, her marriage is like a pretty big mess, wasn't it? I mean, wasn't it like a dumpster fire essentially? I mean, the guy was a real, abusive guy, correct?
He was very abusive, and then she won him back through humility and patience. Anytime he would be verbally abusive to her, she just kept silent. She just kept praying. Eventually he was converted. And, it's funny. It was after he was converted, they were able to have children. It was kind of like when he was in that state of, that sin living in an abusive relationship. It wasn't until his heart was softened and he turned to God, then God eventually blessed them with 2 children. And then she prayed, like, so after he was murdered by, from people from his former, his former way of life, he wasn't the most upstanding Catholic. They sought revenge on him, and then Rita's 2 children tried to seek revenge, and she prayed, Lord, like, take my children before they seek revenge. So that's how her story ended up, how she ended up becoming a nun, because she lost both her 2 children and then her husband.
Wow. Now, on to happier relationships. So couples, like, let's say met, fall in love. What was the dating life? Can you give us a couple anecdotes of dating saints or dating blesseds? Like, what on earth does that look like? Because, I mean, dating, to be fair, is a relatively new historical phenomenon. I had once heard it said that essentially dating came into existence when the automobile came into existence. Because before you had a car, you had courtship. Because if you wished to win the heart of a woman, you would essentially woo her in the presence of her family. But then once the automobile was invented, you could kind of divorce the family from the courtship process, come pick her up, and the 2 of you are kind of off on your own. And so before the automobile was around, it always took place in the context of a family. And so it was courtship, and then with the car, more dating came to be. And, I'm not one to get hung up on, okay, do we have to use the word dating? Do you have to use the word courtship? I think it's more principles behind it that make for a healthy relationship, one or the other. So could you give us some inside stories of what would it look like of this courtship or dating era between meeting and getting engaged in some of the lives of the blessed and saints?
Yeah. So in my first chapter, I was able to use, Father Rippinger. He kind of came up with these 4 stages of courtship. And the first stage is it's the friendship stage, and that's where you're basically for 3 to 6 months. I think it's actually it's around 3 months, I think, and you're in the presence of someone, obviously the potential spouse, and it's all group setting, and there's no you're just kind of getting to know that person. So that could be like you go on even like technically going on a coffee date, right? And you're around other people. And so that's the first stage. And then you go into the stage of courtship, which is another 3 to 6 months. And that's when you go to the courtship, you ask the father for permission, and that's more serious. Again, a lot of this is, this is more in a group setting. And then you have 3 to 6 betrothal, and then marriage. So there's this whole different steps, and you're trying to find out if that person's virtuous. So in each different stage, like the friendship, you're trying to determine if they're virtuous. And then the second stage, you're trying to determine, can this person do they exhibit the virtue of self-denial? And then you go in the court. Then the betrothal is moderation. I know these are all different stages, but to go back to your question, so it's kind of with a lot of these saints, I did see, the more recent ones. I mean, you kind of see like the elements of friendship. So I have a servant of God, Chiara. I can't even pronounce her last name, but Chiara Corbella.
Okay, yeah.
And so, her and her husband, they met they were on a pilgrimage in Medjugorje, and he saw her, and just they had kind of love at first sight. But they went through, a time of, just different. I compare it to a lot of turmoil. They're kind of like going back and forth, and just with Italian couples, you're kind of fighting a lot. And it was their spiritual director that kind of settled. They had the same spiritual director, so he was like their mediator, and eventually got them back together. So I do see it like in that relationship, it was more, this friendship took off, and then they slowly, pursued courtship.
Wow. Yeah, and if people want to read her, I forget, what's the name of her book? I mean, people have probably seen it. She's got this glowing smile and an eye patch, on her. I don't know if you remember the name of her, but if people want to look her up, so Chiara Corbello, is that the last name?
Correct.
And you can even see her on YouTube. There's actually videos of her giving a presentation in Italian on YouTube, and you can read the subtitles. It's so neat to actually watch people whose canonization paths are open, doing conferences and talks in Italy in the 1990s or early 2000s. I mean, it's beautiful to know these guys are around. And, she suffered heroically within the sacrament of her marriage and her illness. Any other ones in terms of dating relationship stories?
I have, the one is Tomas and Paquita Alvera, and they were involved in Opus Dei. Their cause for canonization, I think it's in the works. It's not officially open, but all of their children, they had like a couple of children that became religious, and they met on sorry, Paquita was like 14 years old. She was on a high school trip, and on a train. And Tomas, he was on the trip as well as a chaperone. Tomas's father was a teacher, and again, they kind of had this, I'd say, love at first sight. And then you had the kind of the Spanish Civil War took place. So throughout those 10 years, they wrote love letters. They were kind of, again, just their relationship was tested. And they kind of developed their relationship, I would say, it was a long distance relationship. And then the other one I have is a Venerable Vittorio Transinelli. He's kind of lesser known, but him and his wife, they adopted, he was in the 20th century, they adopted 7 children, and they could only have one biological child. And they met at a university. So, Venerable Vittorio was good friends with Rosalia's older brother. So just kind of, you meet through, and that often happens. You'll have like an older brother be like, hey, I want to introduce you to my sister. So in the context of a college setting, they met and they fell in love. And again, he was more attracted to her. She was not, and he was very reserved. And I think, like, as you know, at Franciscan, a lot of guys in many universities, there's just this fear of, rejection. So they hold back and then they let the girl go on. And then maybe like they come to their senses like 4 or 5 years later and be like, man, I blew it. And then they and then they have courage. But I think how this relationship was, again, it took him several years before he could profess his love to her. And then as she got to know him more, and they fell in love.
Now, just to circle back a little bit, Father Ripperger's points, the 4 steps you said were friendship, and then is it courtship, betrothal, and then was the 4th one engagement?
4th one's marriage. So marriage is considered the fourth stage. Yeah.
Okay, gotcha. So how about any engagements, any specific engagement stories that you discovered in terms of blesseds or saints?
Well, I think, I actually used I only use private revelation for a couple stories in there, and that's just because that's all I have. So I did put Joseph and Mary, Our Lady and Saint Joseph's story in there, which is the greatest marriage of all. And and I relied on Venerable Maria of Greta, which her revelations have been approved by our bishop. But it was neat that it said that our Lord kind of communicated to Saint Simeon, who was like the spiritual father of Our Lady, and he said, I want you to tell her, she needs to be ready for marriage, because Our Lady always pledged her virginity. She never wanted to get married from her youth. And then basically they had all these men come in the temple and they were praying, and they gave Saint Joseph, it was like, a flower or something. And he was discerning, praying. And it was like whoever that lily blossom, that was kind of the sign that was the one that was chosen for Our Lady. And he had that miracle came. And I thought it was interesting with Saint Joseph is that of all the suitors for Our Lady, he was the only one that felt unworthy of her. Yeah. And I think that shows you like the humility. So again, that was in the context of the temple where the two of them were called to each other.
Yeah, no, I mean that goes well, at least in terms of public revelation, when you think of, the angel appearing to Joseph and telling him, do not be afraid to take her as your wife, because that's what conceived of her is of the Holy Spirit. A lot of people, I think, misinterpret that of like, don't be afraid, she didn't, have an affair on you. Don't be afraid. It's okay to bring her. Joseph, I don't think ever thought that she would, because he knew her holiness. The fear I think that Joseph would have had in taking Mary into his own was the fear that you had when you were near the Ark of the Covenant. The fear of and trembling that you approach something that's extraordinarily holy. And so I've heard saints interpret it that way, that's what the angel is trying to reassure Joseph. Don't be afraid to take her as your wife. Not in the fear that she's more of a sinner than you think, but yes, you realize how holy she is, but don't be afraid. I'm still calling you to be wedded to her. And so, that private revelation, although it's not the part of the deposit of public revelation that we're, obliged to believe, it does, in my opinion, at least, in terms of the story and the legends and the flowers, that stuff is supposed to, I think, help support our faith and build it up, but our faith doesn't rest on those things. But it's nice when you hear stuff like that gels well with public revelation of like, Joseph would have felt profound profoundly unworthy of her, and to know that the Holy Spirit had overshadowed her. So now, did you come across any dating stories of saints who got martyred, one or the other or both, in the period of dating and engagement, or was it more married martyred saints that you found?
Yeah. Yeah, there was one, and I'm looking down. I have my index here just to remember all the names. But there was a guy, blessed. Let me pull it up. Blessed Marcel Collot, and he was a French blessed, and he was engaged, and then he was put into he basically died in a labor camp during World War II, and so there's not much is known about him. But just the fact that I think what was beautiful about him is he prepared. It said like up to the age of 20, like that was like the first time he had ever been with a lady, and he had prepared with with the greatest purity, and then and he was shipped off to I don't know which one of the concentration camps, and then he died there. And his bride Marguerite, she never got married, and I think it just shows you like she just knew, like, I don't know, maybe this is the guy, you're the one and only that I was supposed to marry. And she offered up her sacrifice to God, to remain as a celibate for the rest of her life. But that story was, I was really blown away by that, just to show that like some loves, they do not end up on the altar, and I think that was the same with, this is not in my book because she never got married, but there's that, I can't think of her name, Mother Dolores Hart. She was engaged to be married, and she left, and she had that great saying. She's like, yeah, not every love ends up at the altar. And she became a Benedictine nun.
Wow. Now, how about did you come across any married martyred saints?
So there was Blessed Franz and Francesca Jagenstatter. There's I think the movie The Hidden Life about him. Okay. So he was from Austria, and he had a very misspent youth. Like, he even fathered a child before he was married. And I thought Francesca, she took like a chance on him, like even with his baggage. And they got married. And then during World War II, as the Nazis were drafting soldiers, he refused to join them. And so he was thrown in prison and eventually killed. And so he's a martyr. And even they thought like his wife would go and convince him to leave. It's like, you have 3 children at home, and he's like, no, like my conscience is strong. I think he's the patron of conscientious objections. And he goes, no, I cannot support this evil. Yeah.
Now, those that ended up getting married, the saints and the blessed, I'm sure their marriages were nothing but endless whirling romances, right? There wasn't any tough patches or anything like that?
Oh, there's some, no, that's not the case. I mean, I have, the one story I have is Blessed Elizabeth Mora. And when she got married, she was very poor. And so, her husband was a lawyer, and so she was attracted by his wealth. She's like, finally, I'm going to be rescued from this plight of poverty. And she gets married to him, and he ends up he abandons her and leaves the family destitute. And so she had to raise 2 children by herself. But she continued to pray. She prayed like nonstop for him. And then after her death, he became a priest. And so I think it's, the patience of these saints, and that's why I wanted to highlight a lot of these stories. It's not just glamour. There's just a lot of suffering, a lot of betrayal, even from their spouses, and abuse. And I think and these saints, they won them over through their patience and their perseverance.
Now, the Holy Families are often thought of as the seedbed of vocations. And so I imagine you came across some good stories of holy couples raising up saints. But then to balance it out, any examples of saintly couples that had kids who basically went off the rails as well? Do you have any stories in both of those in terms of holy couples raising saints and holy couples having kids that are just off the ranch?
So I actually, in my book, The Parents of the Saints, that we talked about a couple years ago, I mean, I mentioned, just Louis and Zelly Martin, like their daughter Leonie was, she was their biggest problem child. And, she was kicked out of school 3 times. And now she's up for, her process is open for canonization. And they found out she was being, abused by one of their maidservants. So that, so it's like, you never know what's going on. I mean, even the saints sometimes they weren't even in touch. They were just because they had their own business, Lewis and Zelly, so they were overlooking what was going on in their own daughter's life. And so I think that gives a lot of hope to parents out there that, like just to be in touch with your children, but you're not going to be perfect. You're going to make mistakes. And so I think that was one of the stories. I don't think that in terms of the other ones, I focus mostly on the marriage stories, but I did have a guy, Blessed Jacopone, and they call him Crazy Jim. And he was a very, how do I say it? Like, he was a lawyer and had all the money in the world, and he married a very devout woman. And then, it was shortly after they're married, he invited her to go to this public festival, and his wife fell off it was some stands or had a tragic accident. She died, and he led him to convert, and he became a Franciscan brother, and he's up for canonization. So it's kind of I guess, just how God brings sometimes not the holiest courtships together, but even he brings good out of them through a life of conversion.
Yeah, I think it's super helpful for parents to hear that stuff, married couples, because a lot of them think, okay, if I check all the boxes and, I teach my kid the theology of the body, I send them to the right schools, they're in a great youth group, and they go off to a great Catholic college, it's all going to turn out great. And, I know some of the holiest, most devout parents I know, and the kids have just flown the coop. And, it's such a heartbreak for them, obviously, but I've seen so much of this to be like, okay, you kind of appreciate the fact that God gives his kids free will. And sometimes they don't make the best decisions, and the apple sometimes falls very far from the tree. And it's easy for the parents to start beating themselves up. But then you look at Teresa's parents. Mom's a saint, dad's a saint, sister, daughter Therese is a saint, and then her sister's getting kicked out of Catholic board school 3 times for behavioral problems, and really doesn't get her act together until she becomes a nun, I think when she was 37 years old. It's okay. Helpful to hear that stuff. I remember seeing one saint, I was reading Liturgy of the Hours, I forget the saint's name, but his mom operated a brothel. That's what he was raised in. He was raised in a house of prostitution, and he became a canonized saint. It's okay, God, what gives? Here's these holy couples trying to do best they are, the kid's just out to lunch. Then here's this person doing everything wrong, and their kid chooses sainthood. I think it just helps us to surrender, to let go and be like, you know what, God, you love my kids more than I even love them. And I can try to do everything. I can try to lead the horse to water, but at the end of the day, if they choose to reject you, well, the mother, in a sense, delivers them into the world with great pain and suffering, but then both parents participate sometimes with great pain and suffering to bring them into the next world through that redemptive suffering and learning how to maintain your peace in the midst of your kid leaving the faith. I just talked to a friend recently, and, beautiful big Catholic family, and just seemed to do everything right. And now the kids, the boys identifying as a woman and in a marriage with a woman who's transitioned to male. And it's wow, you just never saw the thing coming. And a lot of times the parents, I think, just really beat themselves up way more than necessary. But you need to kind of step back and think, okay, well, maybe God entrusted this very unique soul to you precisely because he knew that you would be the parent that would never give up in interceding and fasting, praying and offering up that suffering for the redemption of that child. And maybe their conversion isn't going to happen on your timetable, but like water welling up behind a dam, those prayers that you offer, eventually in time, the dam's going to crack and all that reserved prayer and grace is going to come flowing into their lives. And so I think it's super important for married couples, dating couples, parents or whatever to hear, hey, sometimes it's messy, sometimes it's difficult. Sometimes Christ crucified visits your marriage in an extremely intimate way and in his own way. And so when that happens, to realize that sometimes the most intimate moments with Christ are when you share in his experience of being forsaken by the Father. When you actually can read the Psalms and it's coming from your own heart rather than just from the pages in a book, there's an intimacy with Christ that comes only in redemptive suffering. And so I appreciate you kind of putting the good, the bad, and the ugly in there. Any last stories that you might want to share with the listeners before we explain where they can go to get a copy?
Yeah, I do have, I have the story of Pope Benedict's parents in there, and it did make national news a couple years ago, and just how the father put in an ad in the newspaper, right? And he said, I'm looking for a devout Catholic woman. And his first words were like pure woman, and then must know how to cook. I have the whole description in my book. And here, he was in his 40s, and and with the war and everything going on, and I feel like it was like him and his wife would have loved to have gotten married, I'm sure younger, but it was like it wasn't in the works, things. And I think just with his job responsibilities, I think a lot of young people they just get so frustrated because like, when am I ever going to find my spouse? And here are two couples, and they had Pope Benedict when they were. Pope Benedict's parents were 50 and his mom was 43 when they had him.
Wow.
I think about, when people get in their 40s, they don't even want to have kids anymore.
Yeah.
They're just done.
Yeah.
And here it's like the perseverance. And I think like our young people, that are watching this, to have hope, like, God's ways are mysterious. Like you may want to get married when you're 20, but ultimately, I mean, look at a lot of these saints in this book, like they turned down people. They could have got married, but they waited for the right person. And it wasn't necessarily the perfect person either, because you're not going to wait. If you wait too long, you're not going to find Saint Joseph, right?
Yeah.
Or Our Lady. But it's like the element of suffering, and I think that's a huge part that these saints reveal to us, that life, that I call it the third ring of marriage, right? You have the engagement, suffering, and then
the engagement ring, the wedding ring, and the suffering.
Suffering, and that one comes at and it's just, I think it's just, that's my last advice, is just for those preparing for marriage is to realize that the cross will come. But I think that the way you prepare for your marriage will ultimately, it can lessen the crosses you do have. Because I mean, if you marry a godly person, if that's what you're looking for, and you meet someone that knows how to handle suffering well before you get married, I mean, your life, I think your marriage will even be more blessed, because how you prepare is how your marriage is likely going to turn out.
Yeah. Yeah. So guys out there looking for a bride, just take out an ad in the newspaper, say, looking for a pure woman, you better know how to cook, and just see what kind of responses you get nowadays. So good luck with that. But I know one thing that I want to just circle back before we close is something you said in passing, that, the dating time, the courtship time, the friendship time, you're really looking like, does this person possess virtue? That question needs to be front and center of the discernment process, because I'm pretty sure it was Ripperger also said, like, if you find the most beautiful person on earth, but they do not possess virtue, you will have a miserable existence in your marriage. But if you marry someone who might not be Mr. Universe, Miss Universe, whatever, but they're virtuous, you're going to have a happy life. Because they're going to know how to give of themselves, to forget about themselves, to forgive, to move on, and to persevere, and to sacrifice. And if that stuff's missing, then it doesn't matter how great all the rest of the stuff is. It's going to be a tough go. I mean, your punishment will be, in a sense, your own choice of just like, you chose the superficial, and now you've got it. And so definitely take that to mind during the dating, because I think a lot of times where people get deceived in the dating is they start dating in the past or future. And what I mean by that, like when the red flags come up, instead of being like, whoa, this is an issue, like this guy's porn habit isn't getting any better, or this woman's really gossipy and superficial or angry or whatever, like you start to like, oh, that's really scary to look at. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to either look in the past as to who this person used to be during this infatuation kind of love bombing phase of their relationship. And I'm kind of, okay, well, that's who they are. And if I try hard enough, then they'll go back to that. Or they start to pivot to the future of, okay, well, if I try hard enough, then I'm going to have this person of my dreams. And then all of these issues that are right in front of my face right now are just going to go away. And so they start ending up dating a person who exists only in the future or only in the past, but that does not exist in the present moment. And so I would say to try to, in a sense, put the blinders on of just like, forget about the future of who you want they to be, forget about the past of who you thought they were, and only look at the present moment. And if you can look at the present moment and be content with that person not changing 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years from now, I think you can move forward with peace in that relationship. But if you you put on those blinders, okay, we're not going to look at the past and the future. We're just going to look at right here, right now. And you can say, look, I don't see myself being content 5 years from now, in peace 10 years from now, if major stuff don't change. Then stay in that present moment and allow yourself to feel the discomfort of like, okay, why am I not at peace? Why am I restless in this discernment process? And really be able to make some tough decisions. And I remember we had Emily Wilson on the show a while back, and she was just talking about like all the engaged couples she's known that have called off the engagement. She's never met a single person who regretted calling off the engagement, but lost count of how many people who regretted not having called off the engagement when they saw those red flags. I remember talking to a girl a few weeks ago, and she said the biggest red flag in her relationship, she said there were a lot of red flags, but she said the biggest red flag was that I was afraid to tell the people that I loved about the red flags that I was seeing, because I didn't want them to tell me that I was right, that these things were real, that this was a major obstacle to lasting love. And so that was the biggest red flag. I didn't want other people to see these red flags. And so I kind of just kept it to myself, and now I was kind of suffering the price. And so I think this book is key in terms of examples of witnesses, of virtues, of what it's supposed to look like. Because in this world of this hookup, friends with benefits culture, it's easy to see what's not supposed to look like. But sometimes it's just helpful when you get the real thing in front of you instead of the counterfeit. So can you tell the listeners how they can go ahead and get a copy of Courtship of the Saints?
Yeah, so it's available at tanbooks.com and also at Amazon. It's pre-ordered. The book will publish May 30th, but you can get the pre-order page is available now for pre-order.
Okay. I mean, so it's a great gift for engaged couples, dating couples, yourself, your boyfriend, girlfriend. And then how about your website in terms where people can find other books and resources that you've created?
Yeah, so my website is contemplativeheartpress.com.
Gotcha. So we're going to put that in a link in the show notes. We're going to put a link in the show notes to where you can support us on Patreon. And then we're about to announce also we're going to be leading a pilgrimage to Italy next January. So we're going to be going to Assisi and over to Rome. And so if you're interested in traveling over to Italy as a Chastity Project pilgrimage, we're going to be having some information coming out on that real soon. Just put that in the back of your radar. But Patrick, thank you for coming on the show once again. I hope the book does very well. God bless you. God bless you and the family.
Thank you, Jason. God bless you as well.